Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to this breaking news panel. As APSA program co-chairs Amani Jamal and I had the opportunity to organize a few breaking news panels, although we had to decide on the topics many months ago. Which we thought was inconsistent with the concept of breaking news, but nevertheless, we decided to try to come up with a few panel topics that we thought would still be of interest to folks as breaking news topics when APSA came around, even though we had to put these on the program a while ago. So my name is Susan Hyde. I work on some of these topics myself, but I'm here as chair of this panel. And I've invited some of my friends and colleagues who do really interesting work on the legitimacy of elections, having to do with a really wide range of perspectives. And so we have people on this panel who focus on foreign interference in elections historically and quite broadly. We have folks who are working on basically survey experimental evidence and whatnot on the determinants of citizen beliefs about the legitimacy of elections. We have individuals who have looked at, I'm just representing a lot of the research of folks on this panel, who have looked at how citizens react to foreign interference in elections or perceptions that foreign actors are supporting one side or another in not just the US, but I think the research is applicable to the breaking news panel topic. And then I have comparativists, IR scholars, and then also a couple of Americanists who are going to talk about the issue of election fraud in the US, election administration, how this relates to public confidence in the electoral process, and then an update on what's going on in terms of the US case, specifically accusations and evidence of Russian interference in elections, and what's the latest on what's going on, what's likely to happen, and I think most importantly, what's not likely to happen. So I'm going to invite up our first panelist, but I'll actually introduce everyone very quickly first. Dov Levin, I just asked you. Dov Levin, currently at Carnegie Mellon University, is going to provide us with a relatively long view of foreign interference in elections. Then we'll invite up Lauren Prather, followed by Sarah Bush. They have done a lot of collaborative work very recently on this topic. It's really, really great stuff. Nikolai Marinov, my collaborator, someone who's worked on this topic of electoral integrity, legitimacy of elections quite a bit. Then we're going to hear from Mike Alvarez, Caltech, and Eric Schickler, also the chair of my department, from UC Berkeley, who will give us the sort of closing look at what's going on in the US right now. So I'll let you guys say a word introducing your work a little bit more if that's necessary, but I've asked all of these members of this breaking news panel roundtable to comment on what's going on in the world a little bit, but base that in what their work tells us about how we can understand what's going on this topic today. So hopefully it'll be a good one. Dov, I would like to. If you have slides. Yeah.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. As today was requested by Susan, I'm going to be providing some historical background to the Russian electoral intervention in 2016, both in regard to partisan electoral interventions in American elections, as well as meddling in elections all around the world. Then I'm going to briefly describe what my research can tell us about its possible effects on voter confidence and the legitimacy of elections. And then I'm going to conclude with a suggestion on how we can protect the public's trust in the electoral process. And the first important thing to know about this Russian partisan electoral intervention is that there is very little that is special or unusual about it, either in regard to the world in general or in the case of the United States in particular. And long before the 2016 election, I constructed a new data set of interventions of these kinds by the United States and the Soviet Union or Russia between January 1st, 1946 and December 31st, 2000, which I call PIG, and it basically uses various archival and secondary sources for this purpose. And what I found when I collected this data was that there were 117 interventions of these kinds during this period, all around the world, as you can see here on this map. Or in other words, in 1 out of every 9 national-level executive competitive elections during this particular period. And the United States and the Soviet Union or Russia have used a variety of covert and overt methods for this particular purpose. From, for example, an open threat by the great power to harm that country if, the quote-unquote wrong party or person is elected, or promises to give it various quote-unquote goodies if the right people are elected. Or, and it can also include the provision of campaign funding by an intelligence agency or other bodies. And the main method that Russia used in its meddling in the 2016 US elections, in other words, covertly leaking documents through WikiLeaks designed to sabotage the chances of Hillary Clinton, is a commonly used method in partisan electoral interventions, part of a type of intervention technique of this kind, which I call dirty tricks. And it was widely used by the United States and the Soviet Union, Russia, during this period. And basically, the Soviets were especially fond of using this method during the Cold War. And I found it was the second most common intervention method that they used during this era. So, when Vladimir Putin decided to use it in order to meddle in the 2016 US elections, he was using a tried and true Russian intervention method, which he probably was taught about when he was, in the KGB spy school, basically. And as you know, for the particular case of the United States, 2016 was actually the 5th case of such meddling in American presidential elections. And the first case of such meddlings goes back all of the way to the late 18th century, to the 1796 US elections, in which the French government intervened against John Adams, which they basically saw as a supporter of anti-French foreign policies, which would endanger them. So the French ambassador to the United States, Pierre Adet, the guy you can see here on the slide, a few days before the presidential elections in Pennsylvania, which was then as now a swing state, published a decree ordering the French Navy to restrict American neutral trade with Europe, and he accompanied it with a lightly veiled threat that if John Adams is elected president, France will see the United States as its enemy. And then a few days later, to emphasize how serious this threat actually was, France called back its ambassador, which was the last step in this era's diplomacy before declaring war. In the 20th century, there were 3 more such foreign interventions in American elections, some of which using techniques quite similar to those used by Russia in 2016. In 1940, for example, the Nazis didn't want Franklin Delano Roosevelt to win a 3rd term. Why? Well, because they were worried, correctly, that if FDR was re-elected, he will eventually find a way to get the United States involved against the Axis. So basically, the Nazis dug through Polish government archives that they captured when they conquered Poland, found, some diplomatic documents that they thought made FDR look really, really bad, and then tried, to get them published right before the election in order to harm, FDR's re-election campaign. Now, there wasn't, of course, any WikiLeaks in 1940, and many American newspapers refused to have anything to do with the Nazis. So instead, the German embassy in Washington, D.C., secretly bribed the editors of an American newspaper, which then published these documents 5 days before the elections, without, of course, informing the American public from where they got these particular documents. Likewise, in the 1984 US elections, the Soviets didn't want Ronald Reagan to be elected, or more accurately, re-elected. So they tried to covertly spread what we would call nowadays anti-Reagan fake news and plant anti-Reagan propaganda articles in various media sources. So actually, there is basically very little that is special or unusual in the Russian intervention in the 2016 US elections, with two exceptions in this regard. The first is the use of cyber hacking for this purpose, which is basically the first confirmed case of its use for this purpose in a foreign meddling in an election. And that, in my opinion, indicates the possible future digitization of such dirty techniques. The second unusual thing about this intervention is that it was exposed so early, and that credible evidence about it came out before Election Day. And basically, for my research on this topic, when interveners want to keep their intervention secret from the public's target, they usually succeed in doing so. And such operational failures are actually very rare, occurring in only 5 covert intervention cases in my dataset. And it usually takes around a decade or so until credible evidence for such covert interventions becomes available. So basically, the fact that we even know this early about this intervention is very unusual. And if it was up to Putin, from what we can know in this regard, if it was up to him, we would probably still have no clue that they were behind this hacking. And if everything would have gone according to plan, we'd be now in this panel, speculating whether WikiLeaks got these documents from a Bernie Sanders supporter in the DNC or some Republican mole there, so to speak. So, there was clearly a major operational failure in this intervention, and Putin is probably pretty unhappy that the Russian involvement in this hack even became known. Okay, so what effects can electoral interventions have? Well, I am now busy investigating this exact question using statistical and other methods, but I can already say some preliminary things. First, in a new paper of mine in the ISQ, I find that partisan electoral interventions can frequently affect election results in the direction desired by the intervener, with electoral interventions on average increasing the vote share of the assisted side by 3% on average. And that is enough, to change the identity of the winner in many cases of such interventions. And when I break it down, by subtypes, the overt interventions of this type are usually more effective in, shifting election results than the covert ones. So, given my findings, and given, how close the 2016 US election was, it is quite possible that the Russian intervention was the thing that tipped the balance. However, to clarify in this regard, there were, of course, other important factors that mattered. And we still lack, in my opinion, fully conclusive evidence as to how it played out in this particular case. So, hopefully the various federal investigations on the Russian intervention will eventually provide such proof either way. In other research that I am now, trying to publish, I find that electoral interventions can have various long-term negative effects on their target. And I'd be happy to discuss some of them later if anyone is interested. And one of the main causal pathways that I find such interventions to have, these negative effects, or at least the public or overt interventions of this kind, is through their effects on the legitimacy of the assisted leader in this regard. So my research is finding that electoral interventions can sometimes harm the integrity and legitimacy of the target's elections. And the exposed Russian intervention in the 2016 US election, regardless of what were its actual effects otherwise, seems to have had such an effect in the case of the United States. For example, in a recent May 2017 YouGov poll, it found basically that 35% of the American public believes that Russia tampered with the voter tallies in order to help Trump. In other words, many Americans believe incorrectly that the Russian intervention also directly compromised the integrity of their vote. And it's reaching the point that in one recent interview that I did on this topic, to a mainstream local radio interview, I was asked by the host in a completely, serious question if the United States in its electoral intervention changed the voter tallies just like the Russians did in 2016. And I had to clarify that what we know about the Russians, what they exactly did and did not do in this case. Okay, so what can be done in order to help improve the integrity and legitimacy of elections? Well, I unfortunately expect such electoral interventions to continue, both in American elections and in elections in other countries. And they're probably going to become even more common in the future. As the number of countries with relatively competitive elections grows, and the cost of military and other intervention methods rise higher and higher, even for major powers. Likewise, given what's happened in 2016, the use of cyber methods for this purpose will probably become more common as well. And if countries shift to electronic voting, such direct hacking of the election results could become possible in another 2 or 3 decades. And I expect many countries will be willing and able to invest in the needed cyber capabilities. So no matter how many cyber defenses are created, it is almost certain that such direct hacking will eventually start to occur. So what I would recommend, and I would be happy to hear the other panelists' opinions and the audience's feedback in this regard, is for the United States and other Western countries to ban the use of all electronic voting machines or any kind of internet or electronic voting, and require all elections to use some form of paper ballots. I would likewise require the votes to be counted only by hand in all polling stations. And basically, by keeping or returning to a paper ballot system and to manual counting, we will prevent such worst-case cyber meddling scenario from happening. And because, paper ballots and manual ballot counting are, of course, immune to such hacking in this regard. Likewise, if such an electoral intervention does nevertheless occur, using cyber methods or the more traditional methods, the widely known impossibility of cyber hacking a voting system depending on paper will at least reduce the harm to the legitimacy of that country's democracy and electoral system by preventing the rise of conspiracy theories of various kinds in this regard. So with that, I am done, and I will give it to the next person.
Great. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Lauren Prather from UCSD to give us her presentation.
Thank you so much, Susan, for inviting Sarah and I here to discuss our work. So we're going to talk a little bit about the determinants of citizen beliefs about election credibility. I'm going to summarize a little bit of the research that we've done on this, which was primarily focused on beliefs about elections in Tunisia. But we've done some recent work on beliefs about the elections around the beliefs about the recent US elections, and so Sarah's going to summarize that work. So in our work, we talk about election credibility. So we take the dictionary definition of credibility, the quality of being trusted and believed in, and the quality of being convincing or believable. So since the primary task of an election is for the people to select a representative, an election is credible if people trust its results and believe that it produces an outcome that reflects the will of the people. Our definition of election credibility reflects the idea that a credible election is one in which the process is generally perceived as fair and in which any problems that have occurred are not perceived to have changed the result. As studies of electoral integrity and election credibility have become more common, a model of citizen beliefs of election credibility has started to emerge. And the literature has told us there seem to be two important factors that help determine whether individuals are going to believe the election was credible. And those factors are an individual's vote choice in the election, so who they voted for, and their perceptions of the fairness of the electoral playing field. So to briefly summarize those, first, vote choice seems to matter for beliefs about elections, primarily as it relates to the outcome of the election and the status of an individual's party in that election. Supporters of winning parties have been shown in a number of countries across a number of elections to have more positive views of elections than the supporters of losing parties. The mechanisms that seem to underpin this are psychological or emotional. So individuals have an emotional response to winning or losing that shapes whether or not they think the election was credible or legitimate. So complementing that literature is a stream of research that suggests beliefs about the electoral environment and its fairness can shape people's beliefs about elections. Institutions that are perceived as leveling the playing field across candidates and parties increase citizen confidence. So this includes things like campaign finance rules or independent electoral management bodies. Our research sort of comes in at that point. We actually undertook a project to understand the role of election monitors in shaping individuals' attitudes about elections. Although election observation is not as widely known or performed here in the US, we think there are still insights from our studies that can be applied to the US context. So to quickly summarize those articles, in a recent article that looked at public opinion in Tunisia around the 2014 parliamentary election, we highlighted how individuals might be motivated by either accuracy goals or partisan goals as they process new information about an election that was revealed by election monitors. So if it's the case that individuals are motivated by partisan goals, they may be biased information processors when they receive this new information that's inconsistent with those goals. If it's the former, however, and they're motivated by accuracy goals, they might process this new information in an unbiased way, but whether or not it changes their opinion about the election is going to depend on what they already think about the election and how strongly they hold tight to those beliefs. In a second article, we actually looked at characteristics of the source of that information. So we varied whether or not the monitors in question were from the US, the EU, the Arab League, or were domestic monitors to try to understand whether or not the source of that information mattered to individuals' beliefs about election credibility. And we theorized that people would be more likely to respond to new information if they thought the monitors were capable and unbiased in their pursuit of monitoring the election. And interestingly, we showed that the Arab League, which is an organization not known internationally for high-quality monitoring, was the group that influenced Tunisian perceptions the most. They were more likely to believe the election was credible when they knew that the Arab League was there monitoring. And this turned out to be because Tunisians actually thought the Arab League monitors were the most capable and unbiased. So although Sarah is going to say more about how these findings apply to the current US context, I'll quickly summarize that in general, we think information about the electoral playing field is an important factor that can shape individuals' views about election credibility. The source of that information is likely to matter, as well as other individual level factors such as individuals' own partisanship, their vote choice, and the content and strength of their existing beliefs about the election.
Okay, thanks. So it's great to be part of this panel with cross-subfield dialogue, so thanks for organizing it, Susan. I want to talk about 2 points basically in my remarks. So the first is to report some findings from the survey that Lauren mentioned that we did around the US election in the fall. And then second, hopefully to spur some discussion, I want to talk about what as we might think for US elections going forward might be the role of election observers or other sources of information that would be useful to Americans. So on the first point, let me tell you about this panel survey that we conducted in the US. So we interviewed about 1,000 Americans in the days before the election in the fall and then in the week following. And we were interested in this survey and to understand to what extent people thought that foreign meddling was happening in the election and how that might be related to people's perceptions of election credibility. So The first thing to note is that, as expected, and as Lauren says, as shown in many previous studies, there is a significant gap between the winners and the losers of the election in terms of how credible they thought it was. So when we interviewed people in the days before the election, Clinton supporters, we used a 10-point scale where we asked people, how credible do you think that the election is likely to be? And Clinton supporters scored on average about a 7.5 versus Trump supporters at about a 5.5. And when we interviewed the same people a few days later after the election result came through, Trump voters increased to being about 8.5 on that scale of credibility, and then Clinton voters dropped down to about 5.5. So a big partisan switch, as you might expect. Now, we also asked questions about perceptions of foreign interference. And the way we did this is that we asked people if they thought that other countries influenced the results of the recent election, and then in an open-ended question, we asked people which countries they thought had the most influence. We thought that these questions would speak to whether Americans thought the playing field was fair for the election, which, as Lauren noted, a lot of literature suggests is important for how people think about the credibility of elections. So about 2/3 of the people that we surveyed before the election did perceive at least some foreign meddling. And of those who thought there was at least some foreign meddling, about 3/4, 74%, said that it was Russia who tried to influence the result of the election. And so we thought this was quite high and interesting, that many Americans were attuned to the possibility of Russian interference, even though, remember, around the election time, this is before a lot of the most forceful statements about Russia's meddling were made by US intelligence officials. Let me also talk a little bit about not just whether Americans perceived foreign influence, but who in the American public was most attentive to this possibility. So we didn't find a lot of variation across factors like your gender, your education level, your political interest in terms of perceptions of meddling, but, and I'm sure this doesn't surprise you, there were very strong partisan differences that emerged, but they only emerged after the election. Okay, so whereas both Trump and Clinton supporters perceived similar levels of foreign influence when we asked them about this before the election, after the election, their perception changed dramatically, and looking here at my notes here for the statistics, after the election, 80% of Clinton voters perceived some foreign influence, in contrast to only about 50% of Trump voters. And the drop that we saw after the election in Trump voters' perceptions of foreign influence, well, it could be due to a lot of factors. Maybe we might speculate about those when we get to the discussion. Let me switch gears now and talk briefly about some of the policy implications that we are thinking about, both in terms of this recent US survey and also drawing on kind of our larger research agenda on perceptions of election credibility. So, as Lauren said, we're finding some evidence, and it's consistent with other people's research too, that shows that election observers, when warranted, can help improve the credibility of elections. And although the United States and other developed countries are active in supporting election observers to go to countries in the developing world, as Susan has shown in her research, this norm of international election observation is not one that has come back so strongly to the countries that have played an important role in funding the operations of election observers. And we wonder if the recent election and these concerns about Americans' trust in our elections might suggest the need for a more robust domestic monitoring network. It is the case that international observers are present at US elections, although in a number of states they're not actually allowed to monitor. But our intuition is that these conditions that seem to encourage the positive effect of election observers on election credibility, like whether people think they are trustworthy, unbiased, capable of detecting fraud, probably international observers are not the observers in the United States that are most likely to have that kind of strong impact. It seems like domestic election monitoring efforts may be more promising. They can be done by partisan groups or nonpartisan groups, but and maybe our Americanist colleagues can enlighten me even more about this, but from the research I've been doing on the internet, 15 US states don't allow nonpartisan citizen observers to be present at elections. And so I think these types of laws make it difficult for nonpartisan groups to have national visibility and impact in helping inform what Americans think about the elections. So we wonder, can these nonpartisan groups in the US draw any lessons from the nonpartisan groups that are monitoring elections abroad? Susan's research has suggested that election observers can do things like exert costly effort to try to enhance their reputation and credibility. Our research suggests that being perceived as not biased, being perceived as having capability is really important to the credibility of election observers. As Lauren says, not everyone's going to update on the basis of the information election observers provide, but some people do. And so we think it might be interesting when we get to the kind of discussion section here to talk about, is there hope for professionalizing, expanding domestic monitoring efforts to try to make them more impactful? So thanks. Who's next?
So thank you to both Lauren and Sarah Bush. I realize I don't think I said you're from Temple University, so apologies for that. Next up is Nikolai Marinov. Are you going to speak? Then you don't need the microphone. Great.
All right. Thank you, Susan, for organizing this. Thank you to my fellow panelists for very thoughtful remarks, and thank you, the silent audience in this. But I'd actually like to sort of ask you a question, for now, exactly. Well, no, yeah, up to now. So if you were to pick at random an election that has taken place in the world over the last 50 or 60 years, what are the chances you think that this country was allowed to hold its election without any interference by the international community? And don't think just negative, positive stuff, anything. Sort of election observers, cyber attacks, whatever. What is your best guess that this country is left in certain percentages to kind of hold its election in peace or alone? A number? Zero. 25. 25 is closer. Okay, I'm going to go for 40. So in other words, 60% of elections feature some type of interventions, and I'm going to tell you where these numbers come from in a sec. What about sort of conditional intervention taking place? What is your best guess of the United States playing a role in that case? 60. I'm going to go for 60 again. So basically, most... No, I'm done with the 60s. That was a good guess, though. So the point is that the United States intervenes a lot, right? The Russians, if you look at the same database, intervene about 15% of the time. That's about a quarter, right? And so what we saw in some ways was basically Mr. Putin sort of saying, well, by the way, it's payback time. You guys promote democracy, you do all these great things, fine. Here's a taste of your own medicine, right? And we have these normative things. We sort of say, well, that was kind of bad, right? I recently got into an internet discussion with some people. So basically, I know, I shouldn't do these things. So the thing was, Erdogan said, like, to the Turks in Germany, don't vote for Merkel. And that was kind of interesting, right? First of all, I wonder who they're going to vote for. AfD, that's a bad idea. But there was a lot of sort of like, you can't do this. And I thoughtfully reminded the audience that the German chancellor herself had just recently remarked on the referendum that Mr. Erdogan himself held, and she said that this was unacceptable. And so here we have Merkel saying these things that when Mr. Erdogan says these things, it's not okay. Right? It's kind of odd. One of the things that's emerging from this research that I'm undertaking and a lot of the folks here are undertaking is that there is a kind of a new norm, or we should recognize that there's a new norm. Susan Hyde, in her own work, has identified the norm of it's okay to intervene in elections internationally when it's to enhance democracy. There's also another norm that's been going on for a long time that we kind of don't understand fully, but it's basically as simple as that. Candidates are supported all the time in elections. You kind of take stances. You go, maybe it's like a visit, maybe people come, maybe it's a photo op, maybe it's a direct statement, maybe it's clandestine, but people do these things like all the time, right? In fact, Dov mentioned some numbers here. If you look at sort of all elections around the world, some kind of candidate support or people saying, how about this guy wins versus that guy wins, that's about like a third of all elections feature that in some form or shape, right? So and that's only natural if you think about it. Basically what's happening in the international arena, we care about this stuff. Like in international relations, for the longest time, we have this very unhelpful debate about democracy and non-democracy. It's much more complicated than this, right? Almost everybody holds some type of elections. Candidates' positions matter. They assume office, right? People, they do what they said they're going to do, right? Elections have consequences. And so, of course, outsiders will have a legitimate interest in this person wins or not. It's either Daniel Ortega or somebody else. We don't like Ortega, right? We're going to say so. I mean, not saying so it doesn't work, right? And so some of the numbers I quoted to you is, you may be surprised to learn, but there's a project going on at the University of Mannheim, and the German Science Foundation has funded it. A couple of the people involved in the project are here in the room, and so we're coding data that pertains to the types of interventions that have occurred in elections, and we're building theories about why these things happen. Just a kind of a very short sort of what's going on there. The data will be publicly available in a matter of months, probably. And you're free to sort of play with it. It's quite interesting, actually. What we can do as a project is kind of limited. We have certain interests, but I think there's more going on in the data. Sort of on the theoretical front, what is going on is that we argue is that these two things kind of intervening in processes, democratic processes and candidates are complements. Basically, the marginal dollar invested to help a candidate buys more or less depending on the underlying rules that will give most states an incentive to mix what they're gonna do. And so most elections actually interventions feature a mix of candidates and process interventions. These are not alternatives. They actually tend to be complements. So I completely agree with Dov, who said that this is not going away. Candidate interventions are here to stay, and process interventions here to stay. It's just kind of time for us to recognize the fact that there's an umbilical cord connecting them and has been there for a long time, right? Another thing that we're studying theoretically is using game theoretic tools is sort of what happens if you have the United States and Russia intervening on opposing sides in a place such as Ukraine. Sort of what does it do to the incentives to invest in candidates and processes? Who wins, who loses? Domestically, including what happens to democracy, right? Presumably, if you know that Russia is going to kind of invest in undercutting democracy in Ukraine, you as an intervener interested in maybe kind of helping democracy, your incentives are going to change in such a strategic setting. So we're studying these things. Another thing we're looking at is basically this idea that candidates' positions are going to be endogenous, and it's kind of, we go even further than that. The idea is that maybe outsiders, when they're trying to influence an election and influence candidates taking positions, they will end up kind of diminishing democracy locally, sort of naturally in the sense of they will, leading candidates will have an incentive to do tricks locally to the electorate so that they can assume very unpopular positions and defend them and win elections with them, sometimes with fraud. So there's a lot of interesting things emerging. And I think the set of people sitting around here and also maybe in the audience show something very positive about this, that we're turning this puzzle, this series of puzzles into research questions, right? And we're studying them, and for that we kind of need to go beyond some of the unhelpful democracy, autocracy things that we study in IR, and kind of open up these elections. They happen, and we have interests, and we do stuff about them. And so I'm actually getting this. You can get more about the project from my website. There's more numbers if you care about numbers. I actually want to keep my remarks short and kind of close with this observation in terms of we as political scientists and how we talk to the media and how this information gets out. Dov kind of alluded to this. I suspect we're interviewed by the same journalist for a public broadcast. I don't think they carried my remarks. And the problem was that I spent 3 hours talking to the journalist, and the journalist had an idea about how this actually works and was trying to make me say this, and I kept telling the journalist that's not how it works, right? And so, yes, people think it works in a certain way. It doesn't. Even though it's extremely frustrating, we should figure out some way of sort of telling them that's not how this works. This is how it works, right? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikolai. Next, I'd like to invite up Mike Alvarez from Caltech, who's going to take us back to, well, he's an Americanist by training, and I believe we'll be talking about the US.
Oh, great. Thanks, Susan, and thanks to APSA for putting this panel on, and also thanks to the APSA powers that be for bringing the conference to California. Thank you. Although we would like it at some point, thank you, to have it down south so that we can all enjoy and not having to wear suits and all that kind of stuff. In any case, I could speak about these topics for a long time. I've been working in this area of election administration and voting technology since 1998. The Voting Technology Project, which I co-direct with Charles Stewart, is Charles here? At MIT, he is around the conference. We've been working on these problems since the Florida election in 2000. And so we built up a considerable body of research on election administration, voting technology, and all of the associated topics, not just here in the US, but also in many countries abroad. We've written papers and published many books about election administration and voting technology in countries like Estonia, where they do internet voting, to countries in South America like Argentina, Central America and Mexico, Australia, Canada, a number of other places where we've studied election administration. So we know a lot about these topics. In particular, we know a lot about election fraud and how to study it. Some of you may know that Susan and I co-edited a book, which was published a few years ago. Had the fantastic title, Election Fraud. So we do know a lot about these topics.
It had a subtitle.
This title is what matters, Election Fraud. So in any case, the 2000 presidential election, I think, sparked a lot of interest and attention in many of these issues, and of course it saw the origins of our project. And in 2001, we issued a report. Our original group was myself, Charles Stewart, Stephen Soliberher, and some computer scientists who included Ron Rivest, who's the R in RSA security, so he knows a little bit about cybersecurity, Shuki Brook at Caltech, Eric Antonsen at Caltech, who's an actual rocket scientist. He became the chief technology officer at JPL and served a similar role recently at Lockheed Martin. So we had a pretty illustrious group. But what the real eye-opener for us at that time was that despite the fact that we were formed to study technology, voting technology, in particular what was going on in Florida, the estimates that we produced were that approximately 3 to 6 million votes were somehow lost in the 2000 presidential election, somehow. There was about 100 million people who voted, so that you can kind of calibrate the magnitude of the problem. The thing is that most of those were lost to just administrative screw-ups. We estimated at that time that about somewhere between 1.5 million to 3 million votes were lost due to voter registration problems. About 1.5 million to 2 million of those votes were lost due to crappy voting equipment, confusing ballots. Now keep in mind that an American ballot is oftentimes 2, 3, or 4 pages long. It's not just voting for one office. And up to 1 million votes were lost because people had problems in polling places, long lines, things like that. So the magnitude of this problem in the US is vast. Election administration in the US is highly vulnerable. It was vulnerable in 2000. It was vulnerable in 2016. It will continue to be vulnerable in 2018 and 2020. So this is a real problem. However, there are real solutions and actual real facts about what to do based on the kind of research that we've done and which a lot of folks in political science are now doing. This, in fact, is one of the most exciting things that's happened in the last 18 years that I've been studying these topics, that there are people in political science, economics, computer science, many other disciplines who study these problems now. We have developed a considerable science of elections, a lot of facts, and a lot of good research. So what happened in 2016? I'll just give you kind of a real quick overview of some of the things that we noticed and some of the problems that we observed. One of the biggest problems that we've been tracking in the last couple of election cycles has been long lines. And this has been something that Charles Stewart has studied extensively. Charles had identified that long lines were a serious problem in the 2008 and 2012 presidential elections. And that problem persisted in 2016. It got a little better, but it persisted. Charles recently produced some statistics based on his survey work that he does to estimate the length on long lines problem. He found that in 2016, 10%, more than 10% of voters waited more than 30 minutes to vote in half of the US states. That's a pretty significant issue. More importantly, significant racial disparities exist in these data. So non-whites are waiting much longer than whites to vote. Okay, so those are two very important facts that Charles has established in his studies of 2008, 2012, and 2016. That's a significant problem which we need to work to fix. Voting technology. We heard a little bit about voting technology earlier. In the U.S., a lot of voting systems were replaced in the aftermath of the 2000 presidential election. The Help America Vote Act released significant funding to states to replace their aging voting systems. That was a time when the lever machines and the punch cards were largely replaced. The fact is that most of those voting systems are still in use today, those ones that were replaced by HAVA. So these systems are now quite aging. Many of them are 16 or more years old. The Brennan Center, who's accumulated a lot of good research on this topic, estimated that in the 2016 election, most voting systems in use had essentially exceeded their useful technological lifespan of about 10 to 20 years. And this is only going to get worse in 2018 and 2020 because very few states are thinking about replacing their voting systems before the next two federal election cycles. States don't have the funds, nor do they have the political will to engage in that kind of large-scale reform in the highly competitive, highly contentious election space that we're in. A bigger problem, and this goes back to the comments at the beginning in the first presentation, is that many states and counties are still continuing to use electronic voting systems without a paper trail. And we can argue about electronic voting systems and whether they should be used or not, but if they're going to be used, and they are going to be used in many states, our argument has always been since 2001 that they should be used in a situation where they generate some form of auditable paper trail. And that still is not the case in many states. Now, there's also been a significant shift in many states and many counties towards remote voting, typically voting by mail. That's a good thing because it helps alleviate the polling place problem. Okay, that's why election officials like voting by mail. Okay, it alleviates the problems of long lines, it alleviates the problems of polling places. However, work that Charles and I have done with Dustin Beckett, who was a graduate student at Caltech, we're now seeing that this shift towards remote voting is largely reversing many of the gains in accuracy and reliability that we saw coming after the Help America Vote Act. Why is that? People who vote by mail make mistakes, okay? They don't sign the ballot, it doesn't get counted. They overvote on those paper ballots, and that doesn't get counted. They make other kinds of mistakes on those paper ballots, and those votes don't get counted. So we're seeing an increase in many states like California in the residual vote rate, which is basically a count of the uncounted votes or the uncounted ballots and races, which is an increasing issue in states that are moving towards voting by mail, and an issue that we need to figure out how to fix. Voter registration. Voter registration is actually one of despite the questions about databases, and we can talk about databases later, this is actually an area where we have seen significant improvement with the election of administrations in the US. HAVA required that every state have a computerized state list. Of course, that's vulnerable to hacking, but they do have the state list at this point. It also required that every state implement some form of provisional or fail-safe balloting. In 2000, only about half the states had that. Now all the states are required to have that. According to the data that the U.S. Election Assistance Commission recently released from the 2016 Election Administration Survey, 2.5 million provisional ballots were cast in 2016. 2.5 million. Okay? These are all votes that have been recovered. And this is really good news. These are votes that in most states would not have been allowed to have been cast and counted, okay, prior to 2000 election. 71% of those provisional ballots were counted, either in part or completely. So again, we're recovering a lot of lost votes. We're recovering a lot of these votes that prior to the reforms of HAVA were being lost due to problems with voter registration. But here's the big problem, okay? And the big problem with U.S. elections is one that we've known about for quite some time. The 2016 election was incredibly competitive. It was incredibly close. You had to have lived under a rock not to hear about it, okay? And yet, according to the Census Bureau, and I don't want to argue about the specifics of how we estimate turnout, that's a whole nother debate, but according to the Census Bureau, the participation rate of the citizen-age voting population in that election was 61%, okay? 4 out of 10 citizen-aged Americans who were eligible to vote didn't vote, right? That's a problem. That's a big problem, right? We can argue about all these other sort of marginal problems, but this is a big problem. We still have a huge voter turnout problem and a huge voter participation problem, and we need to figure out ways to make sure that those people can get out and vote. So what are some things that don't help? Things that don't help are voter ID. Okay, voter identification doesn't help. Strict voter ID laws for in-person voting have been cropping up in increasing numbers of states. 7 states, as of 2017, have very strict photo ID laws. 3 have strict non-photo ID laws. These ID laws make it hard for people who don't have IDs to vote. They make it hard for people who forget to bring them to vote, and it just makes it more and more difficult to vote. And they impose a different standard for people who vote in person than people who vote by mail. People who vote by mail don't have to show an ID when they show up to vote. So this is an increasing problem throughout the country, and as a lot of research has shown, it's really a reform that's chasing this elusive sort of ghost of election fraud throughout the country. Excellent, thank you. So the second thing that doesn't help are fake claims of fraud. All right, so it's hard to disprove a counterfactual. We've all done research on this. There's really no evidence that there was significant voting fraud. Okay, there were certainly interventions and attempts at interventions. We know all about that. But there's very little evidence that there was vote tampering. There's no evidence that the machines were tampered with. As far as we know from what's been released publicly, there was no evidence of any significant tampering with voter registration databases. So, these fake claims are just leading to, again, calls for unnecessary implementation of more restrictive election administration laws like voter ID. And they serve potentially to reduce voter confidence, which some research that we've also done indicates that people who are less confident aren't likely to vote. So that's the second thing that's I think is a significant issue. So I've got like a minute left. What do we want to do? There's a lot of problems that we still need to fix in both how we conduct elections in the US and in the technology we use. We need to make sure that we continue to make the registration and voting process easier, more convenient, more accurate, more secure, and more transparent. This issue about election observers is a very important issue. But some immediate things we can do between now and 2018, we can ensure the accuracy and security of voter registration data files. There's a lot of things that states can do, and I'm happy to talk about that to really increase the security and integrity of those and accuracy of those lists. We need to implement countrywide laws on post-election ballot audits and the implementation of post-election election forensic techniques. Lana Atkinson, I don't know if Lana's here, Lana has written a huge amount about post-election ballot audits. They're very simple to do, and it's a great way to ensure the integrity of the process. We need to continue to figure out how to reduce the lines and long wait times, in particular for non-whites, in particular those who live in urban areas. And where possible, we really need to start replacing these aging voting machines before it's too late. And we have a repeat of the reliability problems that we saw in the Florida election in 2000. So thank you.
Great, thank you. I'd like to now invite up Eric Schickler. He's going to be our last speaker, and then I have a few questions, and then I'm going to open it up to you all, so we'll have a real roundtable discussion. Eric's going to be talking a little bit about what's going on, I think, in Congress.
That is right. Yeah, usual answer to that question is not much, but in this case, there is something. Actually, before I talk about the congressional investigation, about congressional investigations more broadly and as applied to this case, one might ask, given the discussion initially about how widespread intervention is in elections, you might ask why should Congress or would Congress want to investigate in a case like this? And I think a key distinction to make is when the interference is being done covertly and in a situation where the public stating publicly the aims of the intervention would lead to that intervention backfiring. In other words, when an intervention is being done in order to get the country to change a policy that most voters seem to agree with the policy, namely, for example, sanctions on Russia for its invasion in Ukraine, stating that publicly by Russia before the 2016 election, we want to help Donald Trump because we think he's going to ease up on sanctions against us, would seem to not have helped Donald Trump, so they have to do covert action, and therefore, since that's against the policies of the US, that seems like something reasonable for Congress to want to investigate. And then alongside that, the question of whether the campaign colluded with Russia becomes an item of interest, because again, it's one thing when you're working with somebody who's your ally to do something that's a kind of publicly avowed purpose versus covertly colluding to try to influence the outcome. All right, now, as I said, sort of joked initially, the safest prediction in general with Congress these days is that not much will happen, and when it does try to do something, it will be ineffective. And I think it seems at first glance that this would seem like a good case for that, a likely case, right? We have unified Republican control of Congress and the White House, so there's good reason to be skeptical Congress would do much to uncover wrongdoing associated with the 2016 election. But I think it turns out to be more complicated than that. So what I'm going to do is draw on some patterns evident when you examine investigative politics over a long period of time. This will draw in part on my own research with Doug Kreiner. We have a recent book out on this subject. Though I'm also going to lean on studies by a great number of other authors who've looked at similar questions. I'm going to then relate these lessons to today's Russia investigation. Now, it seems it's sort of the take-home point will be that while partisanship clearly plays an important role limiting congressional investigations under unified control, particularly in polarized eras such as the present one, we'll see that there actually is real space for investigations to make a difference. And we're going to talk about the mechanisms, I'll talk about some of the mechanisms through which that happens. And we'll argue that the Russia investigation actually fits many of these historical patterns, which together suggest that congressional investigations can and do play a significant role putting political pressure on presidents with real policy impact. All right. Now, stepping back, I think in studying investigations, the first key question to ask is what is the incentive for individual members of Congress to conduct aggressive oversight of the executive? Now, a first obvious incentive might be that members want to defend Congress's power and the separation of powers system, the constitutional system, from abuses. Now, think of that as your Civics 101, high school civics lesson explanation. Being political scientists, of course, we have to tamp down on that kind of high school civics explanation and say, well, there's a collective action problem, right? While that might be collectively in the interest of the country and Congress as a whole, what incentive would individual members have to provide that collective good? So you need to think about other motivations. Now, a second kind of motivation is individual ambition. Now, you can see investigations as a chance for individual members to raise their public profile in ways that either help them win re-election or move up to higher office or gain power within the institution. And we see some of that, for example, in the House of Representatives now, where Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, has become a kind of rising star in California politics and even national Democratic politics through his aggressive push on this investigation. We're actually now in a kind of new wrinkle seeing a number of members raising campaign funds based on their role either as Democrats pushing the investigation or Republicans trying to tamp down the investigation. I think of that as a new wrinkle on a more general older pattern where we see one important source of energy for investigations being ambitious individual members who see them as a way to gain a national profile. Right. A third incentive for investigating is partisanship. Investigations are not just driven by individual members' ambitions, but can either be encouraged or undermined by broad partisan goals. And I think that gives rise to a kind of simple expectation. Under unified party control, party leaders will have a strong incentive to try to block and limit investigations that might damage the president of their party. Under divided control, we'll expect the opposite. Right? This last goal raises an immediate empirical question. What's the relationship between party control of Congress and the intensity of investigations? Now, the first original surprising finding on this was by my old advisor, David Mayu, who in his book, Divided We Govern, found that among the highest profile investigations, they were actually as likely under unified control as under divided control. But it's worth noting Mayu was looking at a very limited time period in that book, 1947 to 1990, and only at the most intense investigations. So it turns out when you collect data on a broader time frame, as Doug and I do in our book, and other scholars have done as well, you actually do see a gap where investigations of wrongdoing by the executive are more frequent and intense under divided government than unified control. Right? Having said that, there are two important interactions that are relevant to what we're seeing today. The first is that this divided control difference versus unified control is much sharper in the House of Representatives than the Senate. In the House, party leaders have historically been much more effective at reining in investigations under unified control. In the Senate, where individualism tends to be stronger, you have a stronger bent of individual entrepreneurship and actually see about as much investigating under unified as divided control. Second interaction is that this divided versus unified control makes a much bigger difference in polarized eras than when the parties overlap a lot. So, for example, in the late 1930s and 40s, when the Democrats were internally divided, despite unified control, you had really intense investigations of the Roosevelt administration during the war effort. Fast forward 60 years, look at the Iraq War, and when you had unified Republican control from 2003 to 2006, much more polarized era and much more limited oversight. All right, so unified control and polarization are going to interact with one another. All right, now this history, I think, works pretty well as a guide to what's going on in Congress today. First, if you look at the House, the investigations have been mired in nasty partisanship and a strong sense that the leadership really wants to deflect attention from the question of Russian interference. So, sort of most infamously, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, collaborated with the Trump administration to try to shift the focus to the Obama administration and Susan Rice's alleged unmasking of information obtained from surveillance. This is the real scandal rather than what happened in collaborating with Russia. Now, Nunes' effort was so clumsy that he actually had to step aside as leader of the investigation and was replaced by Mike Conaway of Texas, who's actually seen by Democrats as a more reasonable leader of the investigation, and there actually is now, kind of interestingly, more evidence of the House digging into the Trump-Russia dealings in a serious way. So, for example, the recent stories about emails about the potential Trump Tower deal during the campaign that were leaked to the press actually came out of the House Intelligence Committee investigation. Even so, though, I think it's fair to say that more of the initiative has been on the Senate side. And the two leading committees there are Senate Judiciary and the Senate Intelligence Committee. And in both cases, the chair and ranking member have worked together relatively closely on the investigation. And so, for example, in Intelligence, Republican Chair Richard Burr of North Carolina and Virginia Democrat Mark Warner have actually tried to collaborate to try to ensure an investigation that has credibility. Along those lines, it's worth noting that Burr was just reelected in North Carolina and thus might not be as vulnerable to White House or leadership pressure. And it seems quite clear that Burr is keen to try to do an investigation that has credibility, and I think it's fair to say that some of that has to do with his own kind of reputational concerns. So this has meant high-profile hearings, so for example, the Comey hearings in the Intelligence Committee. And also you see the staff really, they've built an effective staff that's doing a lot of behind-the-scenes work. So, for example, working through documents on Michael Flynn's work for various groups, digging into the Trump organization's financial records, and also sending letters to the Trump campaign associates requesting interviews and materials. So I think it's been quite active. All right, so I think it's fair to say, even with unified control, the Senate investigations in particular are serious. Now, before talking about the impact concretely, it's worth noting one other wrinkle, which is the appointment of Special Counsel Robert Mueller, which shifts much of the energy and attention away from Congress's hearing rooms and toward the grand jury and eventual report of Mueller. Now, independent counsels played a big role in high-profile investigations in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, but they've mostly been absent in recent years, in part due to the lapse of the independent counsel statute. Now, there's some concern that special counsels detract from congressional investigations. They become a way for Congress to kind of pass the buck and be let off the hook. But I think we can also think of the special counsel as a kind of safety valve. So the return of this high-profile special counsel provides a counter to the concern that unified control will ultimately prevent Congress from really pushing to the heart of the scandal. The idea that people would be able to keep the worst of the story from coming out is less plausible. And I think it's worth noting that that in turn may change the incentives of congressional investigations and investigators and party leaders themselves. So in other words, Republicans on the Hill who might, in an ideal world, want to keep things from coming out, if they know that it's likely to come out through Mueller, that might change their incentives in terms of dealing with their own investigators and give them a little bit more space rather than just waiting on Mueller. All right. Turning to impacts. Now, I think Doug and I argue in our book that investigations have historically had substantial policy and political effects. But you need to think about distinct kinds of effects. All right, going to be on time, I think. All right, first, most obvious thing to look for is formal action by Congress to fight back against the president. Impeachment in the extreme case, legislation in a more ordinary case to rein in abuses. I think in general that's the least common kind of effect because you think about all the transaction costs and veto points, but we actually do see legislative impact already in this Trump case, where the Russia sanctions bill enacted over Trump's objections by huge margins in both chambers really were, an important rebuke to the president, and I think it's worth seeing that as a really big deal, a sign of how seriously this is taken. Now, beyond such direct legislative measures, there are less formal mechanisms through which investigations make a difference. First, Doug and I find intense oversight tends to bring down presidential approval ratings. Now, there are obviously lots of reasons Donald Trump has historically low approval ratings, but I think it's fair to say the drumbeat of revelations and his heated response to those revelations have clearly not helped. Second, investigations can have spillover effects on the wider policy agenda, both through approval ratings and distracting the attention of the president and his allies. And I think we're seeing that as well in the Trump case, where Trump's political capital and Republicans' political capital and agenda have really been deflected. And again, it's worth noting there are lots of factors for this, for the administration's failures, but again, the Russia investigation clearly has been a serious distraction and dissipated any momentum the administration might have had. All right. Finally, we can even see the independent counsel appointment itself as a spillover effect of sorts. Congressional investigations were among the sources of pressure on Congress, on Trump, that led him to fire Director Comey and thus provoke the appointment of the special counsel. And now, given how long these investigations can take, we could expect it to dog the administration for months to come. So to wrap up, despite all of Congress's well-known limitations, I think it's fair to say investigations are a kind of partial bright spot, an area where, under divided control, both chambers are an effective check on the president, and even under unified control, the Senate tends to act as such a check. And I think we're seeing that pattern play out in the Russia investigation today and are likely to see it unfold over the months ahead. Thank you.
Great. This has been awesome for me. I'm really fascinated by these topics. I want to remind our audience that I've invited our panelists here to talk about a variety of topics. The subtitle to the panel is Russia, Fraud, and Public Confidence in the Electoral Process. The overall conference theme is about legitimacy in political science as a political phenomenon. And I just wanted to push the panelists to have sort of a conversation about a couple of other topics. And if you guys have questions in the audience, please feel free to signal that you have one. I think this session is being recorded, so you have to come up to a microphone and ask your question if you would like to ask one. You can't just shout it at us, as we're accustomed to doing amongst audiences of political scientists. So the thing that I have thought about lately and that I think is really interesting is why public confidence matters and what factors might affect it. So I think that we tend to get focused on whether it was fraud, whether it was interference, whether it was something that we're okay with, whether it was a tactic that is new and different and therefore interesting. But one of the things that I think helps think through this counterfactual is what if foreign interference is aimed at destroying public confidence in the electoral process through perceptions of manipulation without actually engaging in anything that's illegal or wrong or problematic or anything like that? I wonder if any of you just want to take a stab at, I think there's one more microphone. Yeah, Mike has, so I'll pass this one down too. But why do we care about public confidence in the electoral process? And is that the reason why all of this other stuff matters, or do all of these other things matter in their own right or for other reasons?
I can say something. Is this on? Yes, I can say a little something about that. Please jump in too. So, I mean, there's a lot of research, and I'll speak more to the comparative research on this. Maybe those who study the U.S. case more often than I do can jump in on that. But there's a lot of research that suggests that whether people trust elections matters for their subsequent political participation, right? So, and this relates to what you were speaking about in terms of the problem of low voter turnout. So there's, across many countries, across many elections, there's consistently a correlation between how much confidence people have in the electoral process and whether they turn out to vote. And it's also the case that people's perceptions, and Susan and Nikolai, some of your research talks about this too, so jump in, but whether or not people protest after elections relates to how credible people think the election is. Whether there's election violence after an election is related to people's public confidence. So I think that's a big part of why we care about this. And I think I wanted to say one other thing, which is that it's interesting that this research on election observers and how they can enhance election credibility. You might say, some people do say, that international election observation is a form of foreign meddling, right, in elections. Right, yeah, people say that, yeah. And yet, it can enhance people's confidence in elections, even, in the case that we study in the Arab world, where, often it is thought that there would be a lot of skepticism of this phenomenon. So I think it's probably not inevitable that foreign meddling leads to these kinds of problems in terms of public confidence, but we do see it. And I could have said before, but I forgot to, that in our US survey, we found that there is a correlation between whether people perceived foreign influence and how credible they thought the election was. Now, we control for a lot of variables. It's still hard to say whether or not that's causal, but there's a relationship there. And so I think that's suggests maybe the intervention worked if it was designed to undermine public confidence.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing. In that same study, again, it's correlational, but we also do find an association between perceptions of trust in the U.S. election and what individuals state they would do politically over the next 5 years. So people that trusted the election less were less likely to say they would do various political activities in the next 5 years. So again, correlational, but suggestive that there's some relationship between trust and political participation. And I should say Sarah and I are working on a paper that is going to look at that relationship a little bit more closely using some of the panel work that we've done, where we sort of measure credibility in one survey and then associate it in another survey with different outcomes related to political participation. So hopefully we'll do a little bit more to get at that question.
Great. If you have a question, please come up to the mic.
Thank you. Hamid Ghani, University of the West Indies in Trinidad. I just wanted to know to what extent, or is data available to know how many people have voted in early voting and how many people vote on election day? And in terms of that, how does that kind of data analysis fit in with what we're discussing here today?
Mike, I think that's a question for you.
Not quite sure I get the question. So how does it fit into what?
Yeah, we're talking about interference in elections, and therefore, is there evidence of interference in the early voting and interference on election day voting?
Okay.
What percentage voted before the election? What percentage voted on election day?
Okay, on that latter point, the fact question, I will just point you to the US EAC's survey data. I don't have it in front of me, so I don't know the exact proportions. And those proportions, of course, vary by state. Some states have more permissive, some states have less permissive procedures for early and for election day voting. So the possibilities of election fraud and tampering and coercion and attacks on the election certainly vary between early voting and election day voting. And what we have seen in our past research, again, as far as I'm aware, I will just say it again, there's no evidence of any tampering, any malfeasance with either mode of voting that we know of in the 2016 election. However, they have different levels of reliability. With, in particular, remote early voting and people who are voting by mail, there's a lot of ways in which those ballots can get lost. They can also be potentially tampered with. There's the potential for coercion. So there's a lot of issues with remote voting. Remote in-person voting or early voting is actually, in many ways, a safer alternative than voting by mail because, again, those people are coming in, they're authenticating themselves somehow in person, and they're usually casting that vote within an election office or in some place where the election technology, the ballots are secure. So we typically see that as a more secure form of early voting than voting by mail. But as far as we know, there's no significant evidence of any tampering with either mode of voting in the 2016 election.
Great. Great. May I introduce? Okay, go ahead. I have one more question for the next.
Okay,
round.
I'll be quick and then
Yeah.
sit down. Steve Hansen, College of William and Mary, proud Sovietologist from UC Berkeley. And so that raises a question, which is the area studies element to this. I did want to mention that on the panel, which is fantastic, such a great discussion, we don't have any Russia specialists focusing on domestic Russian politics. And I'd suggest that
He canceled at the last minute. I'm sorry.
So it's an important element. Josh Tucker from NYU was here earlier. He had to leave, but I want to call attention to everybody to the work he's doing on social media, bots. He's got really sophisticated algorithms to kind of figure out exactly quantitatively the number of messages on different platforms that come from central Kremlin sources, or ones that are so closely aligned in terms of rhetoric and message that we can deduce either bots or trolls producing them. And it raises a final question, which is about the motivations of people intervening. And I do want to maybe take a tiny issue with what Dov Levine was saying, which is, so if the goal of Putin isn't just to try to intervene against Clinton and for Trump, but to make everyone distrust the entire American democratic system, which I believe really is the case, that's different from just wanting to have a less hawkish person in the country you're intervening. I don't think the US, ever intervened to undermine faith in the democratic process in a country. You might say a place like Iran, Mossadegh, there'd be cases that could be interpreted that way, but it wasn't the intention, right, of the US leadership to say, let's go ruin anyone's belief in democracy in country X. And that may make a difference to understanding the rational actors and the responses to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Naturally, I do not have daily conversations with Vladimir Putin, so I cannot ask him specifically, Vladimir, why did you do it, so to speak? But from what I perceive from reading about this thing, as well as from my research on why these type of things occur, attempts to reduce integrity and that, trust in elections in that country is not usually the goal in this regard. I don't think that Putin's goal was, in this case, to, harm the American electoral system, so to speak. I think that his main goal was to prevent someone that he saw as extremely dangerous to Russian interests from coming to power in the United States and damaging in various ways what he perceives as Russia's interests. Now, as I said, his plan was for this to be completely covert. From what I can learn in this regard, if it was up to Vladimir Putin, we would have had no clue that this has happened. We would have had, today this panel would be about who leaked from the DNC. And the whole fact that it was exposed was a large mishap that, I don't know, someone in the FSB has probably got it shouted, or I don't know, something maybe even worse in this regard for this happening. So I don't think from my research in this regard that this was the goal. This is usually, from my research, not the goal when they do this type of partisan intervention. Okay. Yeah. And usually, if you succeed in these goals, you want the side that want to have as much legitimacy as possible.
Great. Yeah, I actually wanted to build on some of this and just sort of raise another question before I let you ask your question, Paul. But I went to a conference recently that carried a somewhat astounding statistic. It relates to the bots that were referenced in the last question and the last comment, which is the generation of fake news. And I say that, I know it's been politicized as a term, but basically news stories can be produced by machines that look kind of credible without any human involvement in the processing, that at a rate that is so fast and so high that in order to counter misinformation, I think that there's now a movement to try to establish truth bots. But at the present time, we think we need to have people looking at these, YouTube videos and tweets and all of these other productions of information and misinformation, but basically can't be combated by humans. Like, it's at that level of production, and it's really, I think one thing you can take away from this panel is that there's nothing new here, right? Foreign interference has been happening all over the place. U.S. has been doing it for a long time. There's a whole lot of reasons why we think there's nothing new here. But Dov, you said there's something new here. And Mike, I know you know a lot about this, which is the sort of role of technology in some of these accusations. And I think one of the critical reasons that we haven't discussed much that this matters is that once you move into the field of things being run by machines, so to speak, the public confidence question gets harder to solve. So once you have electronic voting, once you have a lot of these things that are automated without a paper trail, right, without an auditable piece of paper that you can follow, and citizens lose trust in that system, how do you rebuild it? I mean, where do you go from there? And what do you think about it? It's sort of, once citizen confidence is broken, how can it be reestablished? So I know we have a couple of other questions. So
well, I don't want Paul to ask a question, so I'm just going to jump in really quickly because one way to think about that to dovetail onto this conversation is that we should be thinking about ways to use the technology to fight that. So one of the things that we've been experimenting with at Caltech since 2014, and Walter Medved has been doing the same thing at the University of Michigan, is doing the same sorts of things that Josh and a variety of other research groups are doing, and collecting vast amounts of Twitter data and using it as an election monitoring device. And we've done a whole bunch of that work. Walter's done it as well. And it's a fascinating tool to think about collecting this information online, trying to parse out the fake from the real. We've done a little bit of work on that, trying to develop algorithms to do that. Not terribly successful working on that. Walter's working on it as well. And I think the technology can be used as a tool to help us find and combat those sorts of problems.
Yeah, though I think one limitation is ultimately, for example, Facebook is a monopoly, has political, there are things it can do, but as a, whether people trust it as a monopoly to do them is a question. And if you leave it up to people, like when they do have people trying to track what are fake sites, Snopes.com gets hit as a fake site. The debunking site gets hit because, so basically the partisan filter is so strong that if you counter it, you yourself can be seen as discredited.
Can I just say one more thing? Is I think there's a lot of information about, fake or otherwise, about the potential problems with the system. And I think so far in the US, we've been operating on faith that the public will be confident in the system. And we don't yet, I think, have mechanisms out there to reassure the public, because I think until recently, the question of whether the American public is going to be confident in the system has just been assumed. And so I think thinking about what mechanisms are available, not just to combat the fake news, but also provide news that is reassuring to the public, I think that's sort of an open question and something that we've been interested in our work on Observer. So.
That's great. Okay,
So,
Paul, you can finally talk.
This is a dangerous question in the form of a statement, but I will be brief and just cut off my mic whenever necessary. I'm really glad.
4 minutes left for the entire
Exactly.
panel.
I'm very glad that you parsed off the news portion from the administration portion, and so I want to speak to the administration because the news portion is a whole separate and big, and I would say a much bigger problem than the administration. On the administrative side, and Mike, I suspect, is going to chime in on a lot of this. On the early vote, I can help you with that, but it's really important to understand that the machines are not connected to the internet. That is so important to understand. Mike sort of said that indirectly, but directly. The vulnerability here is the statewide registration system, not the machines. So even though there are 70–80% of early votes in many states, those machines are not accessible, so it's not like you can mess around with that count. The last thing I'll say, and Mike may want to, if we don't have to worry about Putin harming confidence in our election systems, we're doing a great job on our own. Right? Charles is now in the room. It's been trailing down for about 20 years. So we don't need Putin. We're doing it really well on our own. So I guess I'll throw that to you, Mike.
I'm gonna let our last person who's been sitting there to ask a question go, and then we'll have like 1 more minute to respond. Go ahead.
I'm Cliff Bob from Duquesne University. I just wanted to push back a little bit against the very broad concept of intervention, which I heard, foreign intervention. I mean, to say that when one country comments on or prefers even one candidate to another, I mean, to me that's a very, very weak form of intervention. It's very attenuated, and it's so public. So and there's really no way to stop that either. So I'm not clear on how useful that is to really take a look at. But obviously there are very much more severe forms that could take place. I mean, the most severe, of course, is when a country actually intervenes to take out a democratically elected government, which we have seen. I know the CIA certainly has done this in the past. That's very, very well documented. Then the more intermediate forms, like we're talking about in the US today, I guess this is a question really mostly for Dov, but some of the other panelists as well. I want to know what proof you actually have that Putin and Russia did in fact interfere. I think it's certainly possible, and I speak here as a partisan for Hillary Clinton. I voted for her anyway, but I have not seen any actual proof. All I've seen is an intelligence community report, so-called intelligence community. It's really just a hand-picked few members of the CIA and NSA, it turns out, who say with high degree of confidence or with confidence that the Russians were meddling, which is very vaguely defined. Or I've seen this CrowdStrike report. CrowdStrike is a private company that was employed by the Democrats. So again, I think it's possible, and there may be some evidence out there, but I don't think it's proven. And yet, not only you, but I think major media act as if there's absolutely no question, which has great implications for our confidence in the election. So as a scholar, I think I mean, maybe you have the proof, but I doubt it. At least I've never seen actual definitive proof of it. And if anyone wants to, you can just read the intelligence community report. It's only 20 pages long. It's very interesting to get into the mindset of the intelligence community as well and see how they judge about this and what they actually think is dangerous to our democracy.
Sorry, we have 30 seconds left for the panel, so who grabs the mic first gets to talk. Two people, go.
Okay, so very quickly, first as to the thing about the voting machines not being connected to the internet, I agree. However, much of the electorate may not know these facts, and in my opinion, the mere fact that stuff is electronic and people cannot see who's behind the machine in and of itself creates this distrust, especially in our era of hacking. So I believe going back to paper, which people can understand what it is the best way to increase credibility in this regard. As for the other question about how we know, naturally I am dependent, and we are dependent on what the intelligence community is telling us in this regard, and we cannot see the evidence beyond that. However, from my research on when these things tend to occur, this would be a type of situation where I would believe it's very likely these things to occur. So this evidence that fits in, this is the smoking gun when I'm already expecting to see a murder victim, so to speak.
So if you talk to the people who serve you a hamburger in the Mannheim cafe and they're Turkish and they tell you that they're going to do exactly what Mr. Erdogan says, and that's a credible statement, you'll know that what Mr. Erdogan says is not weak, and it matters. On the it's a data issue, you kind of define your candidate interventions, and then in the data we're coding, we sort of also highlight this is how we define it and this is how we know it. Sometimes we don't know it, and in which case we don't make claims about it.
Great, please join me in thanking our panelists for this excellent breaking news panel.